You're listening to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I almost said Share-a-thon 2022.
It's what it kind of feels like right now.
It does. Thanks so much to our listeners who support, who showed up and have supported KFUO during Share-a-thon 2022. That was a blast. It was fun to get in studio and have live studio guests. And you can still participate in Share-a-thon 2022. You can go on kfuo.org/Share-a-thon and you can click and make a gift there as well. We have a great in-studio guest who was here not too long ago, just for Share-a-thon, just a couple of days ago. Yeah. It is a special day for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, 175th anniversary of the Synod.
I feel like we should have had cake in the studio today.
We should have. That would have been fun.
I would have.
We're going to chat about the 175th anniversary. It's also a call day here in St. Louis at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. What else could we add to this occasion?
Big day. Big week for the Synod.
Any other feasts or festivals going on today? Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for supporting the Coffee Hour. Find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu.
Live uncommon.
So you should have your April issue of the Lutheran Witness in hand by now. If not, then
you need to call someone.
You need to get it because its delivery is really, really slow. You should have your April issue of the Lutheran Witness, which takes a look at 175 years of our Lutheran heritage. In studio today with us, the Reverend Roy Askins, managing editor of the Lutheran Witness and author of this fantastic article in a German name that I'm not going to butcher.
Hey, how's it going? Happy anniversary.
Thank you. To you as well.
I'll be honest, as we were talking about, I'm not going to butcher it either. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to butcher the
guys.
German here. So
thanks.
The title is of the article,
Die Deutsche Evangelical-Lutherische Synod von Missouri, Ohio und Andern Staaten. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly.
So in English, this is the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. And we're going to talk about that, because that's really fascinating to me.
But und Andern Staaten is much more fun to say.
It is much more fun to say, definitely.
It really is.
Yeah.
So
and this was the name of the synod for many, many years, up until I don't know when this would have been the 40s and 50s that we changed it to LCMS, but
because that was too long of a title to put on paper.
It was too German of a title to put on paper.
Yeah.
There after World War I and the World War II, we started kind of distancing ourselves from the German emphasis.
So you got to do, I'm sure, tons of research for this.
Yes.
How long were you researching for this article?
So Eric, our synod photographer, and I visited almost half of these congregations in person.
Wow.
And Eric actually visited all of them, I think, but maybe one or two that we already had photography for. And he made images for all of those congregations. We visited them, we interviewed pastors, we interviewed lay people, and then what's really fascinating about many of these congregations that have this long history, these 150, 175-year-old congregations, these would have been, I guess, at least 175, they typically have anniversary books, like for, 100 years, 150 years, 175 years, and so we got all of this great information. They gave us all of these wonderful booklets and information on these churches, and so... Yeah, spent a lot of time visiting churches and reading old historical records and unearthing all sorts of great little treasures along the way. It was a lot of fun. So
I'm just a little jealous because this is totally my wheelhouse too, of synod history and all of this stuff. I've researched some of this for some of the Lutheran Ladies Lounge podcasts too. So this is a very historical, nerdy Lutheran Witness, and it's fantastic. So you're referring to the original 14 congregations of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we'll get to who those are in a second. Let's back up a little bit though to the start at the beginning. Why did German Lutheran immigrants even come to the United States? So
we had what's typically when we think of the formation of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we tend to focus on the Saxon immigration. So this would have been CFW Walther and Company, and they're landing in St. Louis and then eventually ending up in Perry County. And then the whole scandal that happens with Martin Stephan and And then, so we tend to kind of focus on that side of things, especially because, we're here in St. Louis. But there were Germans migrating to the U.S. for any number of reasons. So part of the reason the Saxons left was for religious reasons. The Prussian Union, they were being forced to join in fellowship with those that they fundamentally disagreed with, especially on doctrines and teaching regarding the Lord's Supper. But there were other reasons as well. The one example would be the Frankenmuth congregation from Neuendettelsau, Germany. And they actually left in a missionary endeavor. Actually, Leah heard the call from Wyneken. Wyneken wrote a letter asking for pastors and missionaries to come to the United States in order to proclaim the gospel to the Native Americans here in the U.S. And Wilhelm Leah was a pastor in Germany. He heard that call, and he came up with this idea of what he called a missionary colony. And he brought together 5 families, and then a pastor, and who wasn't actually married at the time. And he brought together these actually I should say 5 couples, because they weren't 5 families yet. There was only one family, and then there were 4 couples that wanted to be married, but they couldn't be married in Bavaria at the time because whatever the regulations were. They were concerned about having too many kids, and so it was actually very difficult to get married. You had to meet all sorts of specific criteria in terms of income and whatever to get married. So they leave the country, and the first thing they do on the boat is they marry these 4 couples immediately.
I love it.
Isn't that great?
It's so Lutheran.
Yeah. So they leave. Leah brings these couples together and trains them to be a missionary colony. But you can see right away that there's actually already a dual motivation. Part of it is these couples just wanted to be married and live together as husband and wife, and but they also went as a missionary colony, and so they ended up in Frankenmuth, Michigan, which at the time was the front edge of the frontier. They took boats up into the region and then hiked the rest of the way. They had to cut down trees. They built their buildings themselves. Right as soon as they got there, they had literally nothing, starting from scratch. They built two buildings to start with. One was the communal housing, 4 newlyweds and one couple that already had one child. They all lived in one room building, right? And then exactly.
Welcome to life on the frontier.
That's right. And then they built another building, which was the sanctuary, the schoolroom, and then the upstairs, and not really the upstairs, the attic of that room was the pastor's quarters with his wife. He actually met a woman on the way over, on the boat over, and they got married in New York. It was really amazing.
I did a podcast on their story.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story, right?
It's an awesome story.
Well, yeah, she had a child from another marriage, and the people were just absolutely scandalized by this.
Yep.
And they ended up married, and she became a huge blessing to the community. And part of the reason, back to the building. The building was the sanctuary, the pastor's house, but also the schoolroom. And part of what they did is they brought in the Native American children, taught them to read and write, and those children, it became a boarding school, and those children lived with the pastor in his attic upstairs, and his wife became kind of the matron of those children, but then also in part of that Native American community there in Frankenmuth, Michigan. So you have these various motivations. You've got escaping religious persecution. You've got missionary colony. You've got want to get married and can't do that in the old world. There's also simply more opportunities in the U.S. as well, kind of the traditional American reason for coming over here. There was a lot of poverty in Germany, and people realized, there's great opportunities in the U.S., and they migrated to U.S. for that purpose as well. So there's kind of a whole broad range of reasons why there were these migrations coming over.
So you've already given us a little glimpse of what life was like on the frontier for this missionary colony. But looking at these other congregations, there were about 14 congregations. What was congregational life like for these congregations pre-Synod? What was it like to be in a congregation that was? Are we a church? Are we connected to the church back in Germany?
Yeah.
Without the Synod here.
Yeah, so this is one of the struggles. They depended largely on circuit preachers at the time, so they didn't necessarily have a connection or a very strong connection to a church body necessarily. One congregation also in this issue, not this article, but a previous article, we actually visited a congregation that is celebrating 250 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, isn't that great? 75 years prior to Synod, right? And wow. This is a great for us to remember, right? We're celebrating 175 years, and that's great. But it's also helpful for us, and that's why we included this article in that congregation. It's helpful for us to remember that the church preceded the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod,
right.
And it's going to continue to follow afterwards as well, right? And that's helpful for us also to keep in mind. But the reason I bring up that church is they had, as with many of these churches, churches, it started as families gathering together and recognizing the need to gather around the preaching of God's word, and when they were able, the sacraments. But once again, they were dependent on these circuit rider preachers that could only come maybe once a month, maybe every other month, maybe once a year, right? Because these circuit riding preachers covered vast swaths of territory. And it also wasn't always easy to find a circuit riding preacher that you knew was faithful. You know, one story from this is great, the story from New Minden, right? Where the circuit rider preacher comes and he does his thing and then reveals later on that he's actually Jewish and he's only doing the circuit riding preacher thing to pay his bills, right? And of course, the people are scandalized by this. So one of the issues that they quickly realized is the need for some sort of formal organization to oversee the pastors and the preaching, and to bring together into unity one another, so that they can share in this confession and this proclamation. And this starts to happen because CFW Walther is publishing Der Lutheraner, which is the German newsletter that he puts out, and other Lutheran congregations are getting this newsletter and they're reading it and they're saying, this is what we believe, teach, and confess. We need to come together around a church body, which Walther was also advocating for as well. So that was part of the huge struggle. It's just, who do you know as a faithful preacher? How do you know this person's a faithful preacher? You just don't, right? And so that's one of the reasons then for the formation of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or die Deutsche Evangelisch-Lutherische Synode von Missouri, Ohio, and Andern Staaten.
And here we thought that just building your homes from raw lumber, like from logs, cutting down falling trees in order to build your own homes was the challenge. But really, it's just finding a faithful preacher on the frontier, having a faithful preacher for your congregation on the frontier. We will continue our conversation with Pastor Askins in just a moment as we take a look at the 175th anniversary of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod on the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth. Lutheran ladies, listen up. We have something for you.
Have you scrolled through your podcast, searching for one that catches your ear? A place you can escape to with inviting conversations, laughter, and fellowship with your Lutheran sisters? Look no further.
I'm Sarah.
I'm Rachel.
I'm Erin. And I'm Bree.
Join us on the sofa in the
Lutheran Ladies Lounge.
It's a podcast oasis for you, dear sisters, to sit, rest your feet, and stay a while. And on the way out, we'll even check your lipstick.
Lutheran Ladies Lounge is produced by KFUO Radio and available wherever you get your podcasts.
Tuesday's Rumination Law and Gospel will include both myself, Tom Baker, and Mark Smith in preparing you to sing the hymn of the week for the following Sunday, which always focuses on the salvation won for us by the life, death, and resurrection of both Jesus, and through him, our death and resurrection.
Listen to Law and Gospel weekday mornings beginning at 9:30 on KFUO.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
Sarah and I are geeking out and a bit envious of Pastor Askins' nerd trip to get to go. Yes. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yes,
nerd historian trip to go research all this history of the Synod?
Oh, yes. A total nerd trip. I loved every minute of it. It was fantastic.
So jealous.
You'll notice, I think I wrote half of this issue, right? I wrote the two major articles in the issue. So it was like, yes, I get to write all sorts of nerd history.
Yes.
But it's so fascinating. We were just talking even off air, some of the local history too that we have, can go to visit here, some of the sites here in the St. Louis area and Perry County as well. So we talked a little bit about life on the frontier, what that was like, some of the challenges they faced as congregations. How about the pastors? You mentioned circuit riders. For those who were faithful pastors, what were some of the challenges they faced, like trying to serve how many congregations at one time?
Yeah, so, this is one of the things you'll find as you look through the history of these pastors, these early pastors, is how often they actually died rather young or rather soon after taking one of these positions. The guy that preceded Winnikin in the Fort Wayne area. I think he served a year or two before he died, right? CFW Walther's brother actually only served like 2 years at Trinity it's Trinity Soulard now. He only died, he served 2 or 3 years and then he died. And part of that is just because of how difficult the work of ministry was in this context. And as a good example of this, you have Winnikin, for example, and what he did. He served actually a dual parish, St. Paul in Fort Wayne, and Zion and Friedheim, and they're 16 miles apart, which for us today, not a big deal, right? He was doing this whole thing on horseback at the time. But not only that, he was doing circuit riding, which meant he was caring for those two congregations, but then he was frequently traveling in the northeastern Indiana. He was traveling to western Ohio, and then all the way up into Michigan, all on horseback, right? Regardless of the weather, whatever was going on, doing all of this traveling to care for and provide for God's people. Oftentimes, you often find that congregations can't afford to support or couldn't afford to support their pastors financially. So there was one young man who left Germany again, also because of Leah, and came to the U.S., received education here in the U.S. as a pastor, or I guess he enrolled to become a pastor, and then found a congregation actually needed him. So he left his work there because he'd already had some previous training in Germany, came to serve as their pastor, but they couldn't afford to pay him anything. And they said, we just want you to live with us in our homes. We'll feed you from our tables, and you'll just kind of move from home to home, as time allows. And this is how we'll provide for you. And that's what he did. And he cared for the congregation that way. Another congregation, they couldn't afford to build a parsonage. And so they just literally split the sanctuary in half and said, this half of the sanctuary is your home for you and your newlywed wife. It's like a 12 by 20 room that they shared for all of their, housing and kitchen and supplies, whatever. And then we'll meet in the other half for the divine service and for church. Just absolutely amazing.
Short commute.
Yeah, very short commute. That actually probably would be the shortest commute I've seen. So it was very much a struggle, but what comes through clear through all of these histories is how dedicated the people of God were, both in providing for their pastors, but also in providing for their children, that their children might continue to hear the proclamation of God's word. Both in how they taught, but then also in providing resources, building churches. I mean, you look at the church buildings that they built at this time.
They're beautiful. They're
beautiful, right? And they cost, the Trinity downtown, I want to say, it's in here somewhere, $300,000. I apologize, that's not correct. Whatever the number was, it's an astronomical amount of money. And these people were living on the frontier, making virtually no money. But that's how dedicated they were to providing for the church and caring for the church. And so yes, of course, the pastor struggled, but the pastors lived among the people who are also struggling struggling to make ends meet and provide for their families. And yet they were dedicated to it. I know the story that I wanted to mention about the congregations. There were people that wanted to build this church in Trinity Soulard, and the way they did this was by mortgaging their own homes in order to donate that money to build the congregation there at Trinity Soulard. I mean, what dedication. I mean, imagine today, somebody coming to you and saying, would you mortgage your house again so that we could do an add-on for church? I mean, people would really struggle with that, right? But this is how dedicated they were at that time in terms of their passion for providing for the church.
It was 113,000. I found it.
I knew it was in here somewhere.
It was in there. You wrote it.
I did write it. That was in 1865. So just do the math. Yeah, it was a ton of money in 1865.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that support of the pastors. That's part of the reason the Walther League started, too. Now, this was in the late 1800s, but because pastors needed education, they didn't have money. And so a group of guys got together and we're going to fund your education. And that's how the Walther League ended up starting, too.
Yeah. Well, and fun story about Walther League. Its first meeting was in Tonawanda, New York, which was also founding congregation of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Yep.
So, yeah,
so cool.
A wonderful story. Yeah.
Everything's connected. So speaking, I want to get to this before we run out of time. There's so much to talk about. Speaking of the founding congregations, where are these founding congregations in the United States?
And this is why I mentioned earlier, and other states is so amusing.
I love it.
Isn't that amazing? The thing is, it really should have been the Deutsche Evangelical-Lutheran Synod of Indiana. and other states.
Right.
Because most of these congregations are actually located in Indiana. You have, and this really points to the influence of Wyneken in bringing these people together. Of course, you have Walther and his absolutely vital work with Der Lutheraner. But there were only 2 churches in Missouri that joined. Perry County, kind of the heart of LCMS Lutheranism in many ways, there was no congregation in terms of the founding congregations from Perry County. Trinity Soulard joined, and then the other one from Missouri, I'm not blanking right now. Is it New Minden?
New Melle.
New Melle, that's right. They also joined as a founding congregation. But most of the congregations were actually in and around Fort Wayne and that area, and were under the influence of Wyneken. So you have St. Paul in Fort Wayne, Indiana. You've got Zion in Friedheim. You've got St. Peter, Decatur. You've got St. John in Decatur. And then actually the Wilshire, Ohio, and the Marysville congregations are also all part of this orbit surrounding Wyneken and the work that he was doing, circuit writing there in that area. So then you also have, as we mentioned, Frankenmuth, the one up in Michigan, and then there's a couple in Illinois. Now, we talk about 14 original congregations. There's 12 remaining. There were 2 other congregations. One was French, and the other was... I'm blanking on the other one. They joined for about a year, and then it was actually a dual congregation, a dual parish, I should say. They joined for about a year and then kind of fell away. So that's the one congregation that's still not in function or in operation today of the 14 congregations. So,
how did forming a synod? We haven't even gotten to the actual meeting here, but we're going to run out of time soon.
Part 2.
How did forming a synod serve the congregations that agreed to join together as a synod?
Yeah, so one of the things is simply, there are a whole number of ways that this served these congregations. One is that it brings them together around a shared confession. At the time, American Lutheranism was being influenced in ways that were not very faithful. You have guys like Samuel Simon Schmucker, who was kind of a schmuck, who was trying to influence American Lutheranism away from its confessional identity and its confessional roots. In other words, he believed that we needed a new confession that spoke to the modern times, and that we needed to get away from this idea that Christ was really present in the Lord's Supper, that baptism actually forgave sins. He denied all that sort of stuff, and he was American Lutheran, right? And this was somewhat pervasive in American Lutheranism at the time. And so what this did is this church body gave a place for German-speaking American Lutherans to come together and say, here's what we believe, teach, and confess, and to encourage and help one another. But it also helped provide a structure for ways that these congregations can work together. So the result of the merger was that the seminary formed by Walther and the Perry County Lutherans was given to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, so now they could start forming pastors both there and in Fort Wayne. I would note that the Fort Wayne Seminary actually became part of the LCMS when it was formed, and the Concordia Seminary St. Louis was donated a little bit later. You also get Concordia Publishing House as a consequence of this merger, so now you have a church body that is or not a church body, but a publishing house that's creating and publishing content in German for these churches. And so you have all of these things that start coming together and rolling together that enable these congregations to continue to remain faithful to the proclamation of God's Word and the preaching of His sacraments. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. The other thing that it did, and you'll see this in the schooling in particular, is that it helped preserve a German Lutheran identity, and the emphasis there on the German. We continued to use German up until the, kind of between the 2 world wars. Really, World War II is the end of most of German language in our Lutheran churches. But we continued to publish Der Lutheraner until, do you know when we stopped publishing Der Lutheraner?
Oh, this was a trivia question during Share-a-thon, too, and I was totally wrong.
It was. Can you remember?
It was like 1970 something.
Yes, 1974. That's right. Which is absolutely amazing to me. I keep bringing that up just because it just absolutely astounds me. We published Der Lutheraner until 1974 in German. You still have churches like Frankenmuth, St. Lorenz and Frankenmuth, that have a German service once a month, which is just amazing. And there's people there singing in German and can actually follow along. So the formation of this church body allowed this preservation both of a German identity and a Lutheran identity. And that begins to shift into more of an American identity post-World War I and into World War II. But that's kind of what helped them, what they were able to accomplish.
We only have about a minute and a half left. And all of these questions are big questions, so I'm gonna try to give you one that's short. What was the role? This is not gonna be a short question. Was there a role of Christian education, Lutheran education, in the formation of the Synod?
Yeah, so Christian education was probably one of the most important roles that the Synod had. Wyneken, along with Walther, believed that Christian education, and this was in particular Christian education of the youth, was a responsibility of the church. And so every one of these founding churches actually had a school founded alongside. In some instances, the school was actually founded first before the congregation was. And what's amazing is of these 12 congregations, I believe, is it 8 of them still have schools in operation to this day. Cool. St. Paul and Fort Wayne, I think their claim to fame is they have the oldest operating school in Indiana.
Wow.
Continuously operating school in Indiana. Isn't that amazing?
That's so cool.
So because for them, the education wasn't necessarily about advancing one's career, but ensuring that one was firmly grounded in the faith. And I think this is something that we need to work on keeping in the forefront of our minds and maybe recovering a sense of, that the value of Lutheran education isn't necessarily that it gives me a leg up on the guy next to me, but actually it firmly grounds my children in the faith, that if they know that they are redeemed by Christ, it is okay if they know nothing else. This was Bugenhagen said this,
yes.
right? But if they don't know Christ, then it doesn't matter what else they know, right?
Right.
The huge value here is that it grounded their children in the faith, and that was their overriding concern.
There is so much more to learn. We couldn't fit it all in 25 minutes, but go check out the April issue of the Lutheran Witness. Pastor Askins, fantastic job and all the great history. You and Eric did a great job researching this. Thank you for sharing it in this month's issue of the Lutheran Witness.
Glad to do it. Lord be praised.
You've been listening to the Coffee Hour. Happy anniversary to the LCMS. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.